Overcoming adversity is a necessity in life. I think most of us would prefer that life not present us with challenges, but often valuable things come with hard work. Mastering a new skill in sports, in art, in craftsmanship is hard. Relationships test our communication skills and often our patience. But persevering through the difficulties often gives us a tremendous sense of accomplishment. It's not just in our personal and professional lives that we need this same sort of stick to itiveness. It's also true in our spiritual lives. Learning to quiet our minds so that we can pray. Learning to make a regular habit out of reading the Bible and wrestling with it despite its cultural strangeness. Learning to forgive the failings of others so that we can live peaceably with others as Jesus instructs us to. And we face difficulty from not just the disciplines in faith, but sometimes we have to overcome adversity through opposition to our faith. Not everyone is on board with our vision of God's kingdom, and such people may actively work against us. But Jesus, who knows a thing or two about opposition, stands with us as we face opposition. If we respond well, we can see him work wonders. Today, I want to look at an example of how Paul faces opposition and keeps Jesus in his sights during his missionary journey. Now, earlier this year, we did a sermon series called Adventures in Missions as we traced Paul's missionary journeys. Now, we did, I don't know, 7 or 8 installments of that. And then I put it aside for a while because I didn't want to spend too long a continuous period in one book. But now it's been 6 months. And so we're going to pick it up where we left off. And where we left off, Paul had just left Athens and was going to Corinth, and he's in the middle of his second missionary journey. So read with me in the scripture, Acts chapter 18, 1 to 17. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to the preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. When they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own head. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in the city." So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. "This man," they charged, "is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." So he drove them off. And the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. Now, today, when we think of major Greek cities, of course, we think of Athens. But in Paul's day, the most important Greek city was Corinth. Corinth was a major commercial and transportation hub. It was the fifth largest city in the Roman Empire, and it also served as a seat of Roman authority for the province of Achaia, which is the southern portion of modern-day Greece. It's here that Paul invests a quite sizable amount of his time during his second missionary journey. Paul encounters Priscilla and Aquila there in Corinth as a consequence of a recent event and also his own financial shortfall. The text mentions that Priscilla and Aquila are in Corinth due to the recent expulsion of the Jews from Rome. Now, that happened in AD 49, and Paul shows up in AD 50 or 51. The Roman historian Suetonius explains that Emperor Claudius cast out Rome's Jews for indulging in the constant riots at the instigation of Chrestus. Who is Chrestus? Is it just some guy who's a thug? No, no. Most scholars believe Suetonius just misheard the word Christos, which of course is the Greek word for Christ or Messiah. It seems likely that the gospel in Rome sharply divided the Jewish population and led to such discord among the Jews that Claudius exiled them all in order to restore the peace. This bit of recent history from Paul's perspective, probably shapes the Jews' reaction to Paul in the story. In our story today, we see Paul having some success, but I want to focus on the opposition that he experiences. From the story, we see an example of Paul's tenacity in the face of opposition. From Paul, we learn that being faithful involves standing firm and adapting in the face of persecution, and doing so with trust in God. So let's look at the three different ways that Paul faces adversity in this passage. The first type of adversity that he faces is economic hardship. At the beginning of the story, we read how Paul began to work with Priscilla and Aquila. They shared a common trade. They were tent makers. Because Paul had been raised with an eye to him becoming a rabbi, and rabbis weren't allowed to charge to instruct people in the Torah, they would be expected to have a trade that they'd learned in order to support themselves. In the case of Paul, he learned tent making. Now, tent making is not just making tents, it's a leather worker. So he likely would have made other things as well that might have been more helpful in Corinth. So, for example, he would have made sails, and he might have made curtains that they used in theaters. To this point in Paul's story, we don't see any examples of him needing to work a day job to support himself, but here he does. We can see that this isn't his ideal because when Timothy and Silas come from Macedonia, northern Greece, bringing gifts from the churches there, Paul stops his day job so that he can focus exclusively on his teaching and preaching ministry. So the passage isn't telling us that all people who do ministry ought to be supporting themselves, but it shows how Paul is not willing to let adversity stop his work. This detour seems to have borne out positive fruit in his life for a couple of reasons. First, it gave him an occasion to build a strong relationship with Aquila and Priscilla, who go on to become important ministry partners for Paul. It also allowed Paul to set a positive example of a person who's willing to work hard among the people in Corinth. The church in Corinth is an especially difficult one. If you read Paul's letters to the various churches, the Corinthians are the ones that he has to correct the most. It's not really all that surprising since Corinth was widely regarded by everyone, not just moral people, as an especially immoral place. If he had accepted their financial support, they might have assumed that he owed them, and therefore he would have lost the leverage and authority that he has in order to correct them. As Paul explains to the Corinthians in the letter of 2 Corinthians, he accepts financial contributions from the other churches, but he refuses to accept it from the Corinthians. They are accusing him of being a second-rate preacher because he never charged them or never asked them to support his ministry. So in 2 Corinthians 11, 7-9, he says, "Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. And when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. I have kept myself from being a burden to you in any way, and I will continue to do so." Now, some Christians want to make the point that if we follow God, he will bless us financially. And there are times when God does bless us financially, but there are also seasons where we don't experience that blessing. God doesn't always follow a predictable script, but he does have a reason for doing the things that he does. In the short term, Paul might not have understood quite why he suddenly finds himself so short of cash that he's having to work another job in order to support himself. But I'm sure when he looked back at it later, after he developed that relationship with Priscilla and Aquila, and after he'd had a lot of dealings with the Corinthian church, he probably understood exactly why God had done it. There are going to be times in our lives where we don't feel adequately supplied in the way that we think we need. Like Paul, we might need to get inventive in order to keep doing what God has called us to do, trusting that God has a blessing in mind. If our financial ducks aren't in a row, it's not a sign that God has abandoned us or that we have improperly discerned his calling. Maybe God is just working to deepen our trust in him. Maybe he's putting us in a place to build important relationships. Whatever reason we experience this interruption in our financial provision, it is very well possible that God might be using that experience to provide an important blessing in another area of our lives. So Paul faces financial adversity. He also faces religious opposition. Silas and Timothy bring a gift from the church in Macedonia, which allows Paul to finally stop his day job and devote himself to his ministry. Is that the end of the adversity that he faces? No. Paul's message stirs up passionate opposition against him. Now, Paul's strategy involved starting in a place by going to the synagogue. Jews had a built-in hope for the Messiah, so the message about Jesus has a hook with Jewish people. But the message divided Jewish audiences. I mean, first of all, Jesus wasn't the kind of Messiah that many Jews were expecting or hoping for. And for people who felt that God's blessing on them was contingent on them keeping the law, Paul's message, which appeared to marginalize the law, seemed like a recipe to bring God's judgment on the Jewish people. So despite the Jews' messianic hope, they proved not to be a terribly receptive audience for Paul's message. Eventually, things became violently contentious, and so Paul had to adapt his strategy. Now, Paul cared deeply for his own people and wanted them to acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah, but in Corinth, at least, the door for that seemed to be closed. Persistent preaching in the synagogue wasn't going to win any new converts. Paul sees in the opposition not a sign that he should give up, but a sign that he should adapt. After warning the Jewish synagogue that their blood was on their own heads, mirroring Jeremiah's call or a confrontation to the Jews who rejected the message that came from him from God, he sets up shop next door to the synagogue, talk about rubbing some salt in the wound, in the home of Titius Justus, a God worshiper. And by that, it would mean a person who revered God and believed in the truth of what the Jewish religion taught, but he wasn't willing to get the surgery in order to become a full convert to Judaism. No doubt the success of Paul's outreach to the Gentiles might have bred resentment among his opponents, but nevertheless, it proves successful. Now, as we reach out into our community and mission, not everyone is going to be pleased. The opposition isn't necessarily a sign that we're doing the wrong thing, but neither is it proof that we're doing the right thing. We could think, for example, of the Westboro Baptist Church that picketed funerals with signs saying how much God hated the LGBTQ community. Those people encountered opposition, not because they were being godly, but because they were being hateful in the name of God. In their case, the opposition wasn't a sign that they were doing the right thing. But in Paul's case, it's not a sign that they're doing the wrong thing. Instead, when we counter opposition, instead of trying to interpret whether we're doing the right or wrong thing, it is an invitation for us to pray for discernment. We can humbly pray that God would reveal, are we being opposed because we're on the wrong track? Or are we being opposed by people who misunderstand what we're trying to do or who oppose the message of Jesus' upside-down kingdom? If we're following Jesus, we can have confidence and push through. In Paul's case, Jesus appears to him in a vision to reassure him. And sometimes opposition signals a need for us to adapt. In Paul's case, the violent opposition that he faced in the synagogue meant that his ministry there wasn't going to be productive. I mean, if every time you get up to speak, people try and shut you down and it ends up in a fist fight, then there's not much room for constructive dialogue. While Paul's overarching goal, proclaiming Jesus' reign, stays the same, his approach to that goal adapts to his reality. And like Paul, We have the same unchanging goal for our ministry: to be a faithful church who proclaims Jesus' lordship by demonstrating the love and power of God at work among us. While our goal is unchanging, the way we approach that goal needs to be nimble. The pace of social and economic change today is greater than at any point in history. So, to make the most of the opportunities that we have to be willing to adapt quickly. This means we need to be willing to give up on old ways of doing ministry that have borne fruit in the past but are no longer working. When I've talked to some of the people who've been at this church a long time, I've heard people refer to the bean suppers that they used to do. It used to be that people at Northern College were needing a home cooked meal, and so they would have like a bean supper that they would invite people to for a low cost meal. It seemed to be a great way for them to reach out to the community to fulfill a practical need and make connections. But they haven't done it in a long time. I'm not quite sure why they stopped, if it stopped being effective then, but I have a sense that if they said, you know what, we need to dust off that old model and make it work for us again, it probably wouldn't be as successful. I mean, Northern College has far fewer students now. Many of them are international, so they're not necessarily looking for the same kinds of food. We could insist that we need to keep doing it exactly the way that we've done it in the past, but maybe our efforts would be better spent in other places. The old ways don't work forever. So we need to be open to new ways. New ways means fresh ideas, often coming from fresh places. If you see an opportunity and have ideas about how we can meet it, feel free to share it with me, with one of the board of directors, or whomever. Ideas don't need to originate from the people who have formal positions of leadership. Now, churches often have a default posture that says, well, that's not the way we do it here. But I hope that we can discipline ourselves so that when new ideas do come up, the first questions we ask are, how can we contribute to make this an even better idea? And how can we equip and resource you to make this happen? So Paul faced economic hardship. He faced religious opposition. And the final part of the passage today, we see Paul facing legal opposition. Paul's religious opponents are angered by the success with Gentile converts that he's had, and they try to bring legal charges against Paul. This might boggle our mind. Why do they try to bring religious charges against Paul in a secular courtroom? It might seem like, Protestants suing Catholics because of what they say happens to the bread and the wine at the Eucharist. But there are some issues here that make it different from our context. First, we need to remember that the Roman state is not secular. There is an official religion, and all people are expected to participate in it. It's not exclusive. The Romans don't care if you worship your own God, but they do care if you worship theirs. Jews, however, have an exemption from participating in Roman state religion. The Jews have been a conquered people at this point for most of the last 600 previous years, and conquerors over time have discovered it's just not worth the headache of trying to get Jews to forcibly to go along. This was especially true with military service because the Jews refused to fight on the Sabbath day, and in official Roman religion because they would just refuse to worship other gods. Now, administratively, these exemptions weren't a big problem for the Roman state because Jews were only a small percentage of the overall population. And the demand that the men get circumcised to convert to Judaism in a time before anesthetic meant that it was always going to be a small portion of the Roman population. Since Christianity started as a sect within Judaism, then authorities considered Christians to be Jews. So the same exemptions that the Jews enjoyed were initially applied to the Christians. But because Christians didn't require circumcision, and because Christianity was proving so popular among Gentiles, it became a threat to Jewish privileges. Because, if anyone can get out of serving in the army by simply claiming to be a Christian and therefore entitled to Jewish religious exemptions, and there's not the high bar of entry of getting circumcised, then that might mean that there's a whole lot more people claiming those exemptions, and the authorities might just scrap the whole thing. So the Jews who are making charges against Paul are saying that Paul's teaching puts him outside of Judaism. Instead of practicing the recognized legal religion of Judaism, he's practicing a different, unrecognized, illegal religion. They're asking Gallio, the Roman governor, to kind of unrecognized Christianity as an accepted way for people to worship. Now, this group of Jews may also fear that Paul's preaching will cause such an uproar among the Jews that they will be forced to leave Corinth, just as they were forced to leave Rome. And while they're the ones causing the uproar, they no doubt feel that the responsibility is Paul's because he's the one rocking the boat with these new teachings. In many places in Acts, Paul gets an opportunity to offer a fiery oratory to defend the lordship of Jesus, but that doesn't happen here. Gallio simply refuses to hear the case, and the Christians can go on using the Jewish religious exemptions for another 10 years. The story ends with the crowd turning on the Jewish synagogue leader, Sosthenes, whose beating Gallio flagrantly ignores. Now, Gallio seems to be an anti-Semite who doesn't feel the need to be concerned for the well-being of the Jews under his charge. While we sometimes complain about our government's handling of faith, historically speaking, we have it pretty good. Our government doesn't try to force any type of religion on us, and for the most part, they let us practice our faith in peace. This is a wonderful blessing and an historical aberration that we often take for granted. So, in trying to apply this section, I'm not going to talk about how to respond the next time you're dragged before the authorities on account of your faith. Well, that generally isn't happening here. But in this passage, we can see how Jesus protects his people in unexpected ways. The Lord had appeared to Paul and reassured him that he was looking out for him. So when we hear that, we might think, okay, he's going to surround Paul with a group of loyal people who will keep the people who want to harm him away, or maybe he'll send angels to protect Paul. But we can see here Jesus using the negative qualities of some people, Gallio's anti-Semitism, is a way of looking after Paul. This doesn't mean that Jesus approves of Gallio's prejudice. It just means that he can use it for his purposes. Certainly, Paul wouldn't have expected official anti-Semitism to be something that, protects him. It shows us how God's sovereignty works in the world. The bad things that we encounter can still be a part of God's plan. We see this with Israel's story with Babylon. God allows the Babylonians to take the Judahites into exile. The Babylonians are arrogant, proud, and brutal, and eventually God judges them for that. But God is able to harness their will to dominate other nations. Judah, for its part, discovers that there are consequences to being a faithless covenant partner to God. But the exile results in a scattering of the Jewish population around the Mediterranean world. And these Jewish diaspora communities that pop up as a result become a launching pad for much of Paul's later mission throughout the Mediterranean world. So God put the Babylonians' wickedness to use in a way that allowed for a blessing in the future. As we try to faithfully follow God, there will be good stuff and there's going to be some bad stuff. And the bad things might actually lead us to question God's faithfulness, but we can see how God may be using them to plant the seeds of a later blessing. The opposition that we face might be setting up circumstances where the gospel can be proclaimed later on. The opposition might help cultivate perseverance, as Peter writes towards the end of his life. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. We face opposition in the knowledge that God goes with us. He doesn't promise that everything will go easily as we follow, yet we can see that he is faithful. He uses the experiences of opposition as a way of furthering his work. So if God is calling you to a closer walk with him, and you can bet that he is, know that it will not come without cost. But also know that no matter the experiences, the unexpected twists and turns the journey takes, no matter the forces that are arrayed against us, he's with us, watching over us through the opposition. And he is proving himself faithful. So let's not be discouraged because whatever we face it with our faithful Lord by our side.